So, hi everyone, I'm Faisal and I'm working as a senior DevOps engineer at Creative Chaos. So, for today's topic, our session is basically on backup and recovery of an EKS cluster via Velero. So, let me just share my screen and we will start. Is my screen visible to all of you? Fatma, is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So, so for today, our topic is AWS EKS backup and recovery via Velero. So, here is the overall summary of the session, what we are going to do in this session. In the first part, we will have a look at the introduction of AWS EKS, which is basically based on K8s. And then we have Velero, a basic introduction about Velero, what is Velero, and how we are going to use it. Third one is benefits of using Velero or on use over EKS, which is basically it is an open source tool. So that's one of the reasons we are using it. And the fourth one is the prereqs that we need to configure Velero over an EKS cluster. Then I will basically share the steps and the commands that we are going to use or anybody can use over an EKS cluster to configure Velero. Then we will have a look at the best practices that we are going to follow or anybody can follow to properly configure their backups so that in case of any incident, they can use it for their DR or disaster recovery. In the end, in the demo part, we will basically have a look at the commands and I will show you the configuration which I have already configured over an EKS cluster, and we will execute or configure a backup and we will restore it by using some commands. So let's just start with the introduction of AWS EKS. So if you guys are here in the session, most of you probably know about Kubernetes or K8s. So AWS EKS is basically a managed solution for Kubernetes. Kubernetes is an open source platform for orchestration of Docker containers. In AWS basically provides a solution which is named as Elastic Kubernetes Service. In short, we call it as AWS EKS. So why we have to configure a backup if EKS is a managed solution? So it basically ensures data availability, compliance, and disaster recovery. I have already elaborated why we need disaster recovery in case something happens to your EKS cluster, or if a developer or some other guy from DevOps mistakenly deletes a few configurations, your application is going to be affected. So if you have configured proper backups via Velero of your cluster, you can basically restore your configuration at a moment's notice within 30 seconds, you can say, and your application will be up and running. So that's one of the goals for EKS backup and recovery. So why Velero? So Velero is an open source tool for backup and restore and migration of Kubernetes cluster. So I missed the point earlier that if you want to migrate your application from one cluster to another cluster, let's say you have to upgrade your cluster and you are very versions behind the major versions or the newest release, you can simply take a backup of your application and you can restore it on your target cluster. So it basically helps you to migrate your clusters as well. You can properly configure the backup and then you can restore it on the target cluster. So also, Velero basically provides you with a lot of tools, with a lot of you can say opportunities to back up certain namespaces, to back up certain clusters. So it can also schedule regular backups as well. You can restore your cluster to a previous state. Let's say someone deployed something over production on Friday night, and on weekend you get a call that the cluster is down. So you basically come to your Velero and you will restore the configuration of the cluster at a moment's notice. So it will basically help you out to reduce your downtime in case of any incident. And let's say there is a cluster where some resources were deployed, and there is a policy that you have to migrate your instances, or you can say you have to migrate your cluster state to another region. You can do it as well via Velero. So you don't have to deploy or rerun all of your CI/CD pipelines to migrate your cluster state. You can do it with Velero as well. And Velero is basically an open source tool. I have specifically designed this session to configure Velero for taking backups of AWS EKS. You can use it over AKS, or you can use it over any on-prem KS cluster which is configured using kubeadm or KOps, or whatever tool you have used. So what are the benefits? I have discussed a few of them. So in case of AWS, you can seamlessly integrate it with AWS. There are a few simple steps that you can follow to configure Velero over an EKS cluster. And Velero will basically run a few pods in your cluster, and it will automatically take backups. You can schedule backups, or you can take manual backups. Let's say you have a policy, a compliance policy in place, which basically helps you to configure your backups every Friday. So you can manually take a backup of your cluster on Friday night by manually executing a simple command. So there is a simple command which you have to execute to take a backup after configuring Velero. We will have a look at it in the demo session. I will show you the commands. So it's pretty easy. And basically, AWS also provides ways to configure Velero with the EKS cluster so that you can take the backup of your etcd key value store. And Velero is basically Kubernetes native. So as I have already elaborated that you can take backup of any EKS or Kubernetes cluster or an AKS cluster via Velero. The procedure of taking a backup remains the same because Velero provides a Velero CLI which will help you out to configure backups. So the way in which you have to configure Velero over a cluster, it depends from platform to platform. But Velero, after successfully configuring Velero will simply execute or run a pod inside your cluster, inside a Velero namespace, or you can specify any other namespace as well. So it basically runs a pod inside your cluster, which will be responsible for taking backups of your cluster. So I have discussed this point that we can take automated and scheduled backups. You can create a schedule, or you can take manual backups. And you can specify particular resources. Let's say you have a policy to take backup of deployments in your EKS cluster. So you can simply take backup of all the deployments inside a particular namespace, or you can take backup of all the services. It is usually recommended to take backup of a whole namespace because it will copy or create a backup of all the namespaces like ingresses, PVCs, services, deployments, all the resources that are available in the namespace. So what are the prereqs for Velero? So the prereqs that I have defined over here are basically based on how you configure Velero over an EKS cluster. So in case you have a different platform, the prereqs vary from platform to platform. So for AWS, you have to have an AWS account with appropriate permissions. You need an S3 bucket to store your backup state. So basically, you can simply create an S3 bucket. I will show you how to create the bucket, and you have to create a few policies to allow Velero to access that particular bucket. So Velero has to store your cluster state somewhere. So S3 is the best option. It's highly available. The SLAs provided by AWS for S3 are 99.997%. So that's a pretty high availability rate. So that's one of the safest ways to store your cluster data. And another thing you need is an EKS cluster where you have to deploy your application, and then you can schedule a backup or restore it whenever you need it. kubectl is basically another utility to connect with your cluster. If all of you have worked with Kubernetes, kubectl is a basic utility you use to communicate with the kube API server. And then you have to install Velero over your local machine, or let's say you have a policy which restricts you to connect with your cluster from a Bastion host. You have to install Velero CLI over that Bastion host. So once you have installed the Velero CLI, it will automatically connect with your cluster by using the kubectl, and then you can configure your backups. So now I will guide you. There is a step-by-step guide on how to configure Velero over your EKS cluster. So I have mentioned or jotted down the steps in the slides, and in the demo we will have a look at the commands that we can use to basically configure Velero. So the first thing that you have to do is to create an S3 bucket. Simply go to your console, create an S3 bucket, and you have to specify the bucket inside the policy for Velero so that Velero can successfully store data or put objects in the bucket. And the second step is to create an IAM role or user for Velero. So users are usually not recommended. So we usually use service accounts with OIDC based roles, and we specify the cluster OIDC inside the trust relationship of the role to grant permissions to service accounts to access AWS resources. Then I have specified that you have to install Velero CLI to properly schedule backups. And we have to install Velero over the EKS cluster as well. And we have to provide the service account so that it can communicate with AWS and it can store the cluster state to S3. And then we can schedule and test backups as well. So these are the 5 major steps that we can use to configure Velero. So let's have a look at the best practices, and then I will show you the commands we can use to create a backup inside Velero. So once you have configured Velero and you are basically using it to create backups, you have to test your backups at regular intervals. Let's say once in a month you have to manually delete a particular deployment and you can restore it via Velero. So if you have scheduled or you take regular backups of your cluster, test them once in a while, every month or every 2 months. Every 2 months you have to test them. But it is usually recommended to test your backups uh, once in a month, so that once in case of any disaster, you can you have the hands on to properly restore the cluster configuration or the cluster state at a moment's notice. And it is usually recommended to create schedules inside Velero. You can use them to schedule backups, or you can take manual backups as well. So once if you are using manual backup approach, you have to take backups at regular interval. Let's say every week you have to take a backup of your cluster. And then you have to keep track of S3. The backups which are usually stored in the S3, they usually don't take a lot of space. But if there are a lot of microservices that are running on your cluster and your backup size is prodigious in size, so you have to take care of the backups as well. Let's say there must be a policy in AWS for the S3 to delete the files which are 2 to 3 months old, so that your S3, the cost for S3 is optimized and it won't be heavy on your pocket. And then the best practice, which I have already specified, that don't use a user to for Velero. Create a service account and then associate particular restricted permissions so that it is properly backed up. So that's for the theory part. Now we will have a look at the few simple commands which we can use to schedule backups. Let me just reshare my screen. Just give me a moment. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, so my screen is visible now. So the first thing that we have to do, so I have basically jotted down all the steps and the commands that we have to use to configure Velero. It's a huge list, it's a lengthy list, but I'm going to elaborate all of these things, and it will be much easier after the session to basically get hands-on of what are the basic steps to configure Velero. So let me just share my account. So I am in the AWS console and I have created an S3 bucket which I am going to use to create backups for Velero. So you can say I have specified a very random name to this bucket for the demo session. So here is my bucket name, and once I have created the bucket, now I can go to the steps that I have jotted down. So the first thing you have to do, you have to install Velero CLI. So Velero is an open source tool. So just go to their documentation, and you can find a lot of ways to install Velero. Let me just share the docs as well. I'm using Ubuntu, so we can simply type a few words over there, and you will be able to find some documents to install Velero. For Ubuntu, I have jotted down the commands because I installed it yesterday on my PC, and there are other ways as well. If you're using Windows, you can use Chocolatey, or you can specify other ways if you are using macOS via Homebrew. So let's just close this, and we are going to let's just come back to our steps. So these three commands will basically help you out to install Velero. And the second thing is, once I have created the bucket in my AWS account, here I showed you guys that I have created a bucket. So I have to copy paste the name of this bucket, and I have to create a policy. So here is the policy that I have already created, and I have replaced my bucket name inside this policy. So I basically created a cat command to create this policy, and I'm going to show it to you guys over here. I'm going to use Vim and policy. So here is my JSON based policy which I have specified, and I have spe- specified the particular bucket name over here and over here. So this is the most restricted policy. You can specify full access policy as well, but those things are not recommended. So these are all the permissions you basically need, or Velero basically needs to configure proper backups. So once you have created this policy, I have also provided a command which will basically help you out to create this policy. So here in this step, you can see that I am using AWS CLI to create Velero access policy. You can use console as well. Let me just show it from the console. Here is my IAM service. So these are all the managed policies. Let's just have a look at the policy that I already created. So here is the Velero access policy that I already created. So if I go to the edit tab, we can have a look at the policy document. So I have specified the bucket name and also other things which were required for this policy. Once you have created the policy, you have to, there is another command which will basically create an IAM service account in AWS to provide the Velero to schedule backups over an S3 bucket. So for EKS in AWS, you have to create service accounts so that your pods can access particular resources inside AWS. So here is a simple command. There are other ways to create service accounts. Let's just say that you have created your service account via Terraform. So you have to specify the ARN. But for demo purposes, I use the EKSCTL command. EKSCTL is a utility. With the help of EKSCTL, you can create service accounts inside AWS. So if I execute this command, I have already executed it. So if I execute this one, it will create a specific role and attach it to a primary or some. This primary cluster is basically your EKS cluster name. So I stored the cluster name in the environment variable so that I don't expose it over here. And I have also specified the account ID from my environment variables. So once you have configured these values, you just have to execute this command. And as a result of this command, you will basically get a CloudFormation stack. Now, to install Velero over your EKS cluster, you have to connect with your cluster. So to connect with your cluster, there is a simple command which we can use, and it is also available in the AWS documentation. So I will show you how you can find the command connecting with an EKS cluster. So here is the command inside AWS documentation. So you have to specify the cluster name and the region in which the cluster is provisioned. So just specify your region and your cluster name, and it will automatically update your kubeconfig file. So I'm not going to show it to you over here because it's a sensitive file, but this command will help you out to connect with your Kubernetes cluster. And after you connect with your Kubernetes cluster, you can check how many nodes are there, or you can check how many namespaces are there. So let's say here are the namespaces that I have in my Kubernetes cluster as of now. So if you are getting the response of this command, it is basically showing that you are already connected with your cluster. Now to install Velero, you have to, I have used Helm chart for Velero. It's an open source chart. And to add this, the first thing you have to do is to install Helm. It's a dependency. So let's say I want to install Helm on my local machine. So just type a few words, install Helm, and you will be redirected to the Helm's official page. And from there, you have to copy these three commands and it will basically install Helm on your system. This is basically a simple curl command, so you can use it over any Linux distribution. So I'm basically providing all the information regarding Linux-based system because I configure them using an Ubuntu system. So if you are using Windows, there are other platforms. You can find it in the documentation as well. Let's just say if you are using Mac OS, Here you can use Brew to install Helm as well. For on Windows, you can use Chocolatey and other providers as well. So it's completely dependent on you what sort of platform you are using to configure Helm. So let's just say if I execute this command on my local system, it says that I have already added the Helm repo over here. So it's not going to affect my settings. Now, the most important part, how you have to specify certain details to configure Velero properly. So I basically created a command and it generated a file. So I will show you the config file. So here is the config file. So you have to specify the backup storage location, which is the S3 bucket. So I have added the bucket name, which I already created, and I also specified this bucket name inside the policy. And now to install Velero, I have to specify this bucket name inside the Velero configuration as well. You have to specify the region in which the bucket is available. I created the bucket in US East 2 region. S3 is a global service, but you have to specify a region for the bucket. So the region in which the bucket is available, I have specified the provider. If you're using it over other providers like Azure, you have to change this configuration. So I am installing it over an EKS cluster. So for me, it's AWS. Then you have to specify the Velero plugin. There are certain init containers which are basically helps out Velero to be configured over an EKS cluster properly. So I specified the plugin for AWS and I specified the version for the plugin. Then these are the mount paths and other things. And the most important thing you have to do is specify the service account name. So I have created the service account with the EKSCTL command, and now I have to specify the role ARN inside my Velero configuration. So if I go to the IAM, I can use this role. Let's just say I can have a look at the role as well. So here is the service account configuration that you have to provide. Copy paste this ARN from your account. It will basically, if you use EKSCTL, it will automatically add the OIDC for the cluster inside this trust relationship, and you will be able to configure Velero properly. So here's the Velero config that I have used to configure Velero over an EKS cluster. And now the most important command, which is Helm install command. So the highlighted command on my screen basically helps you to create a namespace with the name Velero, and then you have to specify the values file, which I just showed you guys. You have to specify the path of this configuration file to install Velero over your EKS cluster. And then we will test out a few deployments. So these are all the other commands. Let's just have a look at the pods of the Velero which are configured over the cluster. So I will simply create an alias for kubectl. Now I can use kgetns, and these are all the namespaces. So I have to look the Velero config. So just list down all the things inside the Velero namespace. So here is the deployment for Velero, which is already in a ready state. The replica set is up and running, the service, the cluster IP service, and the pod. So once you install Helm over your EKS cluster, these are the resources that are provisioned. Beside these resources, CRDs are provisioned at the backend, which will basically allow Velero to create backups from the cluster. So they are at the backend. Now, once we have configured Velero and I can see from the previous command, I can see that my pods are running. Here are all the pods. So as they are, as my pod is in a running state, now I can create an application or I can create a namespace, and then I will take a backup of that namespace and I will restore the config for a demo purpose. So I basically created a command to run a simple Nginx container with a service. So I'm going to copy this and I will create an application. So this is basically a sample application that I have created. It's a simple Nginx deployment with a container, and there will be two replicas of this service, and I have created a service of type cluster IP for this Nginx. So we will create a testing namespace in our cluster, and then we will schedule backup for that namespace. So I'm creating a namespace named as test. So it basically gives me an error that the namespace test exists. So let's just get the namespaces and check whether the namespace that I'm specifying is already created. So here it is. I yesterday created the test namespace, and let me check what I have specified in my deployment file where it's going to be deployed. So I have specified the namespace in my config file as well and in my service file. So my deployment and my service will be deployed in the test namespace. So let's just apply this. So two of the resources were created that I have specified. So my deployment file basically created two resources or two pods with the deployment. The replica set was created, and then a cluster IP service was created inside this namespace. Now we have to configure a backup for this namespace, this particular namespace. And we will restore it via Velero. And I will manually delete the resources and we will restore these things. So let me just reshare the other screen.
Still, we have a few questions. We have, I think, one question. So, would you like to take them in the end or right now?
I can take it right now.
So, there is one by Kuram. How do we decide which namespaces or resources should be included or excluded in Velero backups?
So I will basically specify the name of the resources column inside my Velero backup command. So now we have configured or installed Velero over the cluster. And in the next step, we will specify which namespaces we want to take backup of. Let's say I have created the test namespace, so I will specify the name of the namespace in my backup command. So it will basically help me to specify certain resources. If let's say can specify if I only want to take backups of my deployments or of particular services, so I can specify within the Velero backup command.
Thank you. If anyone else also has questions, they can either raise their hand or write it in the chat or in the QA option.
Let me give me a second. I'm going to reshare my screen. So just give me a moment. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes. There is another question as well. You want to take that?
Okay, just give me a moment. So as you already know that AWS S3 is already encrypted. So if you want to manage the compliance requirements, just encrypt your bucket with a self-managed KMS key. Or if you, but they are already encrypted. S3 buckets are encrypted. You just have to make sure your buckets are not public so that no one can access them publicly or the data inside the buckets. Just make them private. It's already encrypted. If you want to add an extra layer, use self-managed keys to meet the compliance requirements. So it totally depends upon the compliance team of your company and the rules they have in place so to ensure data security. So let's just create our first backup. So now on your screen you can see the command from which you can create your backup. I have created a backup test backup. Let's just say I have created a backup. Velero backup create. You have to specify the name of the backup and then you have to specify the namespaces which you want to include inside your backup. So as of now, I have a cluster and I have deployed some resources in my test namespace. So I have included the namespace and now I'm going to create my first backup. So there is a response once you execute this command, which says that backup request for test backup new submitted successfully, and you can check the status of the backup by this command. So let me just describe the status of this backup. So here you can see the first thing you can see is the name of the backup, then the namespace in which Velero is deployed, and then there are certain labels which Velero uses at the backend to configure backups. The phase basically defines if you have a huge cluster and there are multiple services, it's going to take a few more minutes to take the backup. For me, it was just a single service deployment file and a service, so the backup is already completed. If there are any errors in your backup, you can have a look. It will basically display all the errors inside this command once if there are any. Now, as of now, there were no errors or no warnings, and the resources which were included. So all the resources static basically indicates that all the resources were included in this backup. And there are other things as well, like when the backup was started and the completion time for the backup and when will the backup will expire. So by default, backup expires in 29 days. And it also provided me the details how many items were backed up. So once the backup is created, Velero, I can check the Velero backup get. So it basically showed me all the backups that are created. So the status for this backup I have created is completed, and it showed me the time and the number of days in which the backup will expire and all the other details. Now, once we have created a backup, let's just say have a look at all the resources that were available in the test namespace. So here are the pods and the deployments that are available. So let me just delete this. I'm going to delete all of these resources. So here is my file. I will delete these resources. So as you can see, now there are no resources in this namespace. So let's just consider a scenario where someone has accidentally deleted the resources in a particular namespace, and you have already created a backup via Velero, and now you have to restore it. So we will basically restore the state. I will jot down the command Velero create restore. So this is the command to create a restore point. Let's just get the backups first. Velero backup get so that I can show you the name of the backup. So here is the name of the backup. Now I will create a restore. Oh, sorry, jotted it down. Restore, create from backup, and here I have to specify the name of the backup which I have already created. So here is the name. I will copy paste this name in the command, and then there is this flag which I have to specify. Include namespace, and I will provide the name of the namespace which I have already backed up. So I think there is an error. I missed something. Let me just copy paste my command. So my restore command basically gave me a response, and it basically showed me that you can check the status of this backup as well, this restore as well. So let's just have a look at the restore. So the restore is completed, and it basically showed me all the necessary details. Now let's just check the namespace. So as you can see that previously I deleted all the resources in my namespace. The pods were gone, the deployments were gone because let's say someone accidentally deleted the resources. Once I have created a backup, Velero will basically help me to restore the state of that particular namespace within a moment's notice. So let's just say as of now I had a simple application and a deployment and a service. If you have hundreds of microservices that are deployed in a particular namespace, you can restore them at a moment's notice. So that's where Velero becomes handy. There are other ways to restore the state of the cluster. You can rerun your CI/CD pipelines to deploy all of your microservices, but it usually takes a lot more time. So when it comes to time, Velero is much handy. So let's just create another backup. We will try out some random scenarios. list down the resources, and now we'll test if you want to restore a particular application or a deployment and you don't want to restore the service, how we can do it. Let's just try it out. I'm going to delete all the resources again in this namespace. So let's just test if there are any resources that are left behind. So no resources are available in the namespace. Now I will use the other command. Let me just rename the backup name. Now this time let's just have a look at the logs of the restore. Previously we had a look at the state of the restore. Now let's just have a look at the logs. So here are all the logs that were created for this particular restore, and you can see that the things were restored. It is in a complete state. So let's just have a look at all the resources. So now you can see that the service was not restored. And if we have a look at the command that we use to create the restore point, you can see that I specifically told Velero to include particular resources. And I specified that you have to restore the deployments from the backup. And you can see that the one deployment for the Nginx that we have already created was restored. But the service which was present in the file was not restored. Let's just say have a look at the service. So here we have the cluster IP service and it was not restored. I explicitly told Velero to restore a particular deployment. So there are many other scenarios you can carry out to test the types of backups that you want to create within Velero. And all of them will be stored inside your S3 buckets. And now let's just create a backup of a particular deployment. Previously, we backed up the whole namespace. Now we can check. We use this command to create the backup of the whole namespace. We can explicitly told Velero to create backups of particular resources. Let's just say you have a dev namespace and there are many applications that are running inside the namespace, but you want to take backups of specific deployments which are critical for the devs, and you want it to be restored over in a moment's notice so that the experience for the developers remains smooth. Let's just have a look at the command.
Still, we also have a few questions, so whenever you want to take
Okay,
them.
okay. Let me just give me a second.
Yeah, Osama,
So,
we will, sorry, Osama, yeah, just give us a second. Vessel, once he's available to take questions, we will answer.
so by default, Sama, the volumes are already included inside the backups, PVC volumes. But if you have specific volumes or configuration stored inside your EKS cluster, that is not a good approach. We usually don't follow it here. So Kubernetes was meant to run basically stateless applications. That's one of the reasons you don't use databases inside Kubernetes. So if you want to create databases or stateful sets inside Kubernetes, they basically store data inside the PVCs. And to store your database inside PVCs, that is one of the worst approach that you can follow. So I usually recommend to not store your data inside Kubernetes or volumes. So while designing the application, we usually ask our devs to store the data inside S3 buckets. We provide them access to the S3 buckets, and all the other necessary details we usually provide them on the cluster level. But by default, if there are any volumes inside the cluster, you can take backups. So if you execute this command, Velero create backup command, which I already executed, it will basically take backup of all the volumes inside that particular namespace. It will automatically take the backup, and once you restore them, they will automatically be restored. But if the data inside the volumes is of prodigious size, let's just say of 10 GB, of 20 GB, or 30 GB, it's going to take some time to create backups as well. So that's one of the reasons we usually don't recommend to store your application data inside PVCs in K8s. And the next question. Velero can't update. Can Velero also update the kubeconfig file? No. Velero can't update your kubeconfig file. I already updated it previously, and my Velero CLI was able to pick it up, and it was able to connect with the cluster. Okay, so that's a good question, Osama. Uh, I will open the Velero restore reference for you. I encountered the same scenario where we had a client whose DR account was a bit different than the primary account. And let me just share the things which helped me out. So if you have private ECRs in one account and you have another DR cluster in another account. So I will share a link with you in the chat, which will basically help you out to solve the scenario. So I have shared a link in the documentation.
Could you also read out the questions aloud, the ones that you're answering? For example, I think Osama wala to you did. Now I think there's Bilal and Khurram ka left, I guess.
So Sama basically asked another question. So I
Yeah.
am currently addressing it now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So as of now, I'm on question which Osama asked. So I'm just going to share my screen so that Osama can have a look at the documentation. So Osama, if you please have a look at the screen, my screen, I have opened the Velero restore reference where in your question you have specified that if my cluster is in a different account, let's say in which I want to restore, what about the S3 access? And I'm using private images which are in ECR. How will Velero manage that? So for ECR, you have to replicate your images inside the AWS accounts. In your primary account, you have to enable ECR image replication, and it will automatically copy your images once you push them. Once you push an image inside a repository, it will copy your image inside the target account. And for Velero restore, you have to specify a config map, which basically says that you have to specify the cases. Let's just say for case one, we have to replace a particular name with another one. So what I suggested to my client was we created multiple cases for the ECR image names. So once Velero, you have to create a config map before you apply the restore command. Before execution of restore command, you have to create a config map, and then you have to specify the image names which you want to replicate. So you have to create multiple cases and it will automatically change the image names from, let's say, 111 5000 to 222 3000. It will automatically replace the name inside your restore command for S3 access. So for S3 access, what I basically designed in the last month, that I replicated my primary. You have to enable S3 replication. So replicate your S3 from your primary account to the DR account, and it will automatically create, or you can say, all the files that Velero has already created. So it will replicate your data from in the S3. And in your recovery cluster, you have to install Velero again with specific permissions to that bucket. So once you are in the DR and there is a situation where you have to restore the configuration of the cluster, you will simply execute Velero restore command, and in your DR account, your Velero will basically be connected to the bucket in the DR account. So replicate a Velero bucket from primary to secondary account, and then you can execute the restore command in your recovery cluster. So that's one of the ways I configured it for one of our clients. You can follow other ways as well, because if you have to replicate the bucket, it will add some cost. Let's just say $2 to $3 for the data replication, because it's a small amount of data. Depends on the application. If you have a huge application and you have to replicate a lot of data, then it will automatically add up to the cost. So Bilal, if you can specify what sort of enterprise level applications you have to back up through Velero, can you please clarify your question with an example? Usama, so I basically designed this for one of the clients. That is one of the ways I was able to figure out what you were actually asking. So if there are any other scenarios, you have to test them out, because as I have already told you that we are not using PVCs in any of our clusters. We are using stateless clusters. We are using node groups. We are not using Fargate profiles, but our clusters are completely stateless. There is no single pod in our cluster which basically stores data on the EKS cluster. We haven't created even a dynamic, you can say, class inside our cluster to provision PVCs. But if you have to restore PVCs, you have to replicate your, let's say, EBS volumes as well. That was one of the scenarios I was thinking about, but you actually ask a very good question. So you can have a look at it as well. How to replicate your volumes. So there is inside the documentation, you can have a look at it. The changing PVC storage classes, how you can change them. You have to create config maps dedicatedly for that as well. So Velero basically provides you ways to change your storage class, the name of the storage classes, or to replace the name of the storage classes in your recovery clusters. And then the volumes will be provisioned. And once you execute the restored, it will automatically restore your data inside the volumes. So let's just have a look at it as well. That was an additional point that I wanted to add regarding your question. How to test disaster recovery scenarios using Velero in AWS EKS. So, Khurram, you can test it out in many ways. I can specify a path for you, because it totally depends upon the drills that you conduct on a day-to-day basis. Let's just say you have a requirement in place that once a disaster recovery drill is in place, you basically delete a particular namespace and then restore it, or you delete your ingress controllers and then you restore them. So it totally depends upon the requirement, how you can execute your drills. So I can't specify a way. We usually figure out, depending upon the requirement of the client, that how we are going to perform DR drills. So there must be a DR run book in your company, you have to define it on your on the basis of the application that you are executing inside the cluster. So I can't specify a definitive pipeline through which you can perform DR drills. It's a subjective matter. So it totally depends upon your requirement. So Khurram has a question. Can Velero be integrated into a CI/CD pipeline to automate backup and recovery process? Uh, you can create a CI/CD pipeline. You just have to install Velero CLI inside your CI/CD backup, inside your CI/CD, and you will be able to connect with your cluster. Let's just say if you're using GitHub Actions, you can simply use an action where you basically gain access of your EKS cluster, and then you install your Velero CLI and you connect with the cluster. So you have to execute a few commands which I already showed you. You can use all of these commands inside a CI/CD setup, but Velero is already a backup solution. So using a CI/CD over it, that in my opinion, it will be an over-engineered solution to restore your backup via CI/CD, because CI/CD is going to take some time. If you want to restore immediately a particular namespace and you have a small amount of services, you can do it in 30 seconds. So why using a CI/CD to restore your backup, which you can manually do in 30 seconds? You just need access over your EKS cluster. So it basically adds the overhead of CI/CD. So it totally depends on your approach. Let's say one question: can I take backup using cron job? You can do it. You have to create a specific cron job, or you can. So I took some questions. So there is this command which you can use to restore, or you can basically create. So you can create schedules as well inside your Velero. You can create schedules. So if you want to use a cron job inside a K8 cluster, I wouldn't recommend it, but you can create a schedule. You can have a look at the documentation. It basically provides you a command, Velero schedule, and the cron job expression you have to create. And Bilal has asked a question. Let's say a courier service company having separate application for admin client and mobile application deployed on Kubernetes cluster. So cross account and cross Bilal. So Bilal, let's say a courier service company having separate application for admin, client, and mobile application deployed on Kubernetes cluster. So I'm assuming you have created multiple namespaces. So if you have created multiple namespaces, you can schedule backup of all of those namespaces, and then you can restore them once you need them. How we can handle cross region or cross account backup and recovery using Velero. So I basically elaborated a few sections which Usama asked. So Khurram, basically in case of cross account recovery, or you have to configure Velero over your primary cluster, and then you have to configure Velero over your recovery cluster. And you have to create S3 buckets in both of those accounts. And S3 bucket, the data in the S3 bucket in the primary account is replicated in the data, or in the S3 bucket in the recovery cluster, or in the recovery account. Once you schedule backup, data is already copied to your S3 bucket, or the state of the cluster is copied to your S3 bucket, and it is already replicated to the other account. And once you restore or perform a Velero restore, you have you can take that particular backup name and you can restore it. You gave the S3 bucket name to Velero once the backup is created. It also stored in the S3 target? No, no. So you have to enable S3 replication in AWS to replicate your data into another account. It won't copy your data in the target bucket. If someone has deleted something in the queue system namespace, yes, you can take backup of your kube system namespace and you can restore it as well. Are there any other questions?
If anyone has any more questions, you can write them in the chat or raise your hand. Uh, Faisal, is there anything else you would like to discuss from your demo, or is that complete? You're on mute, Faisal.
So I think for demo part, it's complete.
Okay, I'm just sharing a feedback form in the chat for everyone. We would really appreciate your feedback for this session so we can in the future deliver more productive sessions. So if we don't have any more questions, you can give it a minute more. If we don't have any more questions, then we can wrap it up as well. So, and I've shared the feedback form as well. The recording for this call will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and it will also be emailed to all the people who registered for the session. Just give us a couple of days for that. And we will also be emailing you the feedback form as well. So I think there aren't any more questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Faisal, for this session. As someone has already said, it was an amazing experience. So it was very detail oriented, very technical. So thank you.
And
Uh,
I would like to add a few more details. Let's just say if there are any ambiguities which were not covered. So by default, if you want to create a backup of your whole cluster, you can do it as well. So I specifically scheduled a backup of a particular namespace. So if you want to create a backup of your whole cluster, you can do it as well. Just don't apply or include any flags of include namespaces and it will automatically create a backup of your whole cluster. And once you are restoring, you can specify those things as well.
okay, thank you.
So you can take backup of your whole cluster and think I clarified it.
Great, then we can wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to see you for our next learning series session as well. And thank you once again, Faisal, for this session.